Hi everyone, I'm recording this from Singapore following the release last night of the Australian federal budget because I think there are some really important implications emerging for the ASRS rollout and particularly for the Australian mid-market. And interestingly, I think some of the budget commentary is already being misinterpreted. So a lot of people have focused on the possibility of revised thresholds for large proprietary companies. But in my view, that's not actually the most important signal in the budget from an ASRS perspective. The most important signal is that government is now openly acknowledging that the implementation burden associated with climate disclosure is becoming too complex and too expensive, particularly for mid-market businesses. And I think that matters enormously. The market has already changed. So one of the things I want to address up front is the idea that the market is somehow waiting. It's not what we're seeing as a business. Group 1 reporters have already gone through first-year reporting cycles, boards are engaged, audit committees are engaged, finance teams are already operationalising disclosure processes. And at the same time, Group 2 entities are actively preparing right now. So I think the important thing to recognise is that the market has already moved beyond the "is this happening" phase. So that debate is effectively over. We're now entering the operational phase of climate disclosure. And operationalisation is a very different challenge because once disclosure becomes operational, organisations suddenly realise that it's not just a sustainability issue. It becomes a finance process, a governance process, a controls process, an evidence management process, and then increasingly a business operations process. And that creates real complexity. So what is the budget really signalling? Well, the key line in the budget that stands out regarding this is improving the efficiency of climate-related financial disclosures. And I think that wording is incredibly important because the government is not signalling rollback. It's not saying climate disclosure is going away. In fact, the broader budget reinforces climate governance, transition finance, resilience investment, and disclosure infrastructure. What the government is really signalling here is, we understand that this is becoming operationally difficult, and that's a very different message. So the conversation is no longer should companies disclose. The conversation is really becoming how do companies do this efficiently? And I think that shift defines the next phase of the market. So the Australian mid-market is in a particularly difficult position. So large corporates to a large extent can absorb complexity. They have the teams, the large finance teams, the transformation budgets, the ESG functions, and internal governance capability, and also their external advisors. But many mid-market businesses simply don't, but they're still facing increasing pressure from their lenders, insurance, enterprise procurement chains, investors, and, of course, the regulators. And what we're seeing increasingly is implementation fatigue. A lot of organisations are trying to manage this through internally with spreadsheets, fragmented ownership, duplicated workflows, manual evidence collection, and that's even if they know what they need to do. So that model is not sustainable long term for the mid-market. And this is where the market, I think, is heading, and it's going to evolve significantly over the next few years. So historically, climate reporting has often been approached through consulting-heavy transformation programs, bespoke advisory models, and highly customised frameworks. And there'll always be a role for that. I don't think that will go away. But across the mid-market, I think the strongest demand increasingly becomes practical implementation, operational support, workflow management, governance coordination, and disclosure execution. So in other words, the market starts favouring operational capability over the more broader theoretical strategy. And I think that's really important. So one of the solutions that we've been talking about with our clients and the market is minimum credible disclosure. And I think the budget environment actually reinforces why this matters. So minimum credible disclosure is not about minimising compliance. It's about creating a practical, defensible, operationally sustainable approach to disclosure. Because the reality is that most organisations do not need another theoretical framework. They need a way to operationalise governance, a way to coordinate evidence, a way to manage workflows, and a way to become disclosure ready without creating another large transformation burden internally. And importantly, we don't think that it's just a software issue. I mean, certainly the budget talks about digitisation, and we definitely help in that space. But the market increasingly needs software infrastructure, AI, also combined with implementation support, managed delivery, and operational guidance and expertise in this space. And that's where we think the market's heading. Now, obviously, one of the major discussions coming out of the budget is the possibility of increased thresholds for large proprietary companies. And yes, depending on how Treasury progresses reforms, there could absolutely be implications for the lower end of the Group 3 category in the market. But I think it's important not to overreact. Firstly, the budget itself does not explicitly say that ASRS thresholds will change. Secondly, even if some entities move outside of mandatory reporting, disclosure pressure is increasingly coming from the broader commercial ecosystem anyway. Banks, procurement chains, insurers, enterprise customers, investors. And those pressures, they're not disappearing. So while the shape of the mandatory market may evolve, I don't think the broader disclosure capability market goes away. In fact, I think it becomes more operational and more embedded into normal business processes. So overall, my read on the budget is actually relatively constructive for the market, not because regulation is increasing, but because the government is effectively acknowledging that disclosure now needs to become operational, practical, efficient, and sustainable. And I think that's exactly where the next phase of the Australian market is heading. The organisations that succeed over the next few years are unlikely to be the ones with the most complicated frameworks or the biggest implementations. They're likely to be the ones that can operationalise disclosure efficiently and credibly. And that's where I think the really important shift is now taking place across the market. If you want to read more about this, check out our article in the links. Feel free to reach out anytime and have a chat. Thanks, everyone.